Welcome to HRUnpacked, a podcast about HR workplace issues, where we analyse and then discuss the latest developments in HR and employment law that impact both employers and employees. Welcome, Kate.
Brilliant. Yeah, great to be here. And we're really privileged to have Cary with us today. We're going to talk everything wellbeing at work. Obviously, there's been significant change since COVID and the pandemic. Lots of really good issues to talk about today, including presenteeism, leaveism, the importance of really good quality line management and ensuring for good wellbeing within the workplace, the right to disconnect. All of these subject matters are going to come up today with the expertise we have in the room. And without further ado, we're absolutely delighted to introduce Sir Cary Cooper, distinguished psychology and professor specialising in organisational psychology and workplace wellbeing. You're currently 50th anniversary professor of organisational psychology and health at Alliance Manchester Business School, University of Manchester. So quite an accolade and lots of experience and brilliant information you're going to be able to share today. You've had over 4 decades with a prolific career in this subject matter, which is fantastic. And I believe you've written over 250 books. So it's going to be a great conversation. We're really pleased to have you, and we're really thankful for your time today. So without further ado, let's get the conversation going, Jonathan.
Thanks, Kate, and welcome, Cary. So the big question is why are organisations and global leaders actually discussing health and well-being?
Oh, it's a big topic now. And what's important about this topic is that, in the good old days when this first started, I should think about 15 years ago. Well, let's say 20 years ago, we were looking at stress at work. That was a big issue. And that kind of morphed into, hey, wait a second, stress management is one thing, but how do we change the culture of the organization? And that really became quite an interesting thing. And I think what primed this whole area was the financial crisis of 2008. That was really the stimulation because so many people lost their job. Then organizations said, hey, we've lost all these people. We're coming out of this recession. That was a dreadful recession, a bad news one. And they said, the organization, well, how do we retain and attract good people? I mean, this is it. It's about our culture. There's going to be an element of stress management in all this, but we need to change the culture itself. And that's where I think it began. And it began in not a particularly a strategic way. It began in, let's have well-being days and smoothies and ping pong tables and bean bags. I mean, what I call low-hanging fruit. And let's do a little bit of mental health first aid and, mindfulness at lunch and all that kind of stuff. Then it started to change, and it really has changed. The research then showed it hits the bottom line. That's what made the big difference, I think. And gradually, I think the feeling was that to attract and retain, particularly the next generation of people, this is the big driver. You're talking the Z generation, the young millennials. We need to have a different kind of culture. And so I think that was the big driver, at least for the banks, for example, and the finance sector, which is very important to the UK. They were doing, I remember talking to an HR director of a big bank, and I said, why are you guys doing this? You never did anything before the financial crisis. And he said, right. Regrettable turnover. I said, ooh, that sounds nice. I think I should write a book on that. What do you mean? And he said, we cannot afford to lose our key staff. He meant labor turnover. So we're creating a different kind of culture. And that became it. And then, of course, stress-related ill health, i.e. what they call the common mental disorders of depression, anxiety, and stress, are now the leading cause of sickness absence in every developed country. Every developed country. Go to Europe, go to North America, everywhere. UK, it's between 52 and 57% of all long-term sickness absence is for anxiety, depression, and stress now. Musculoskeletal diseases, i.e. backache, which 20 years ago used to be the leading cause, are now only a quarter of the total of long-term sickness absence. So long-term sickness absence, talent attraction, talent retention, and the big one, our wonderful productivity in the UK, which is bottom of the G7, tied with Italy, and 17th in the G20 on productivity per capita. So that's another big thing. So what are we going to do to get the productivity up, retain people, get stress levels down?
Do you think, obviously COVID had a significant impact following that recession some years later. What do you think have been the dramatic or significant changes since that period in our working lives?
Well, I mean, Kate, I think we know one is hybrid working. And I feel sorry for those organizations now that are doing something rather stupid, which is they're saying, now we all want you to come back. It started with one investment bank, which shall be nameless, but it's an American one. GS is initials. Anyway, who then the chief exec said, I want everybody back in the office 5 days a week. Well, you know what my students say? I'm not going to go work there. You know, we have great MBA students. They're not going to go to work for them. They don't even want that on their CV anymore. They don't even want the imprimatur of a high profile organization that has a command and control culture. And that's an illustration of that kind of culture. So hybrid working is definitely here to stay. We have the technology for it, cost of living crisis, two earner families trying to do everything, working partly from home, partly from central office is a good news. So I think we know that's one aspect of it. But I think the other aspect of it is we learned during the pandemic that looking after people, I mean, HR, like you, Kate, would have said to people who are working from home, you would have probably told your line managers, make sure they do one-to-ones with your staff. You know, not just your team meeting, but do one-to-ones, see how they are. Are the kids okay? Because they're having to learn from home, all that stuff. And we didn't do that before. When we're all in an office, we didn't do as much one-to-ones as we should have done. And nothing to do with work. I remember calling up young academic staff at the university and saying, you know, Fred, how are you? No, don't worry, I'm going to get that paper. I'll get that. No, I'm not interested in your paper. I'm just interested in you. What's going on? We also saw people as we worked virtually. We saw their families. That's another thing that happened. So I think HR truly became more HR in the sense it was saying, come on, these people are alone. They're isolated. They're worried because they think they could lose their jobs in this pandemic. And many of them are furloughed, etc. Look after them. Look at them from a individual, personal point of view. Forget the job bit. The job bits you can do when you have the team together. But, you know, and I think that was another indirect thing that I think and I hope we hang on to that as we go back to the office more and you know, into hybrid working. So I think there are two things. And I think the third thing, but I think we'll talk perhaps a bit about this later. I think we then realized as a result of the pandemic that the most important factor in the workplace is the emotional, the EQ of the line manager, the social interpersonal skills of the line manager. The ones who couldn't cope, who didn't do well in the pandemic, it highlighted the importance of the line manager. And that's, for me, that's really important, Kate, because the model that we have in the West is this. We promote people into managerial roles and recruit them based on their technical skills, not their people skills. That is fundamental. Until we get parity between the two, our productivity is not going to be good. People will leave. You know, the old euphemism, you don't leave a job, you leave a boss. And I think that's come to roost as a result of the pandemic too. So those three things I think are
I really that last point around the emotional connection with your staff and understanding them as people, that really resonates with me, because I always say to the leaders in my team, you know, you've got to understand your staff, the obvious thing, you've got to know what makes them tick, but that that familiarization, that understanding of who they are, where they come from, and what gets them going is so key. So I do agree. I genuinely think that became more intelligent and better over COVID. And like you, I hope that's around to stay, because that makes for such a good employment relationship, knowing them inside out and working with them with that emotional connection in mind. So yeah, thanks for that. That's really great. That's really useful. It's interesting.
Do you think, Cary, that we've gone back to the kind of the early 1900s? I wrote an article about Cadbury's because it celebrated 200 years of being around Cadbury's this year. And what we found out, I mean, I've known this because of my HR background, is that Cadbury's and the welfare officers that they kind of set up did do what we're now looking at in terms of checking on the welfare of staff. It was linked to productivity, obviously, because obviously productivity was something that they were keen on. But it seems that we're going back to the early 1900s, whereby we are checking up on people, we are making sure they're okay, and it is down to the line manager. Do you think we are going back to that kind of era where we have got a real empathy with?
Well, I hope so. I actually happen to be president of the Institute of Welfare, which is it used to be called the Institute of Welfare Officers. They still exist, by the way, but they tend to exist in the public sector, not the private. Even when I first came to this country that many decades ago, the church even had priests and vicars who worked in what were they called? I forgot what they were called at the time. Their church was actually industry. So they used to go in their modus operandi was to work within a company like a welfare officer did, just walking around the company as a vicar. And it was really interesting. So we still have a bit of that. Will going back to the office a lot more, or will the pressures of hitting the bottom line overtake this move to be a bit more compassionate and empathetic and all the rest of it? I hope it doesn't, but that again goes back to the line manager, Kate. That goes back to when you hire somebody in from outside or promote them, are you ensuring that they have the people skills? And I'm frightened that we don't do enough of that we don't do the parity between the two. It's still, he was great at marketing, therefore we'll make a marketing director. That's a different job. She is great at teaching a classroom, so we'll make her a head. You have to make sure that person actually has the people skills, the social skills, the interpersonal skills. And you have to find a way of measuring it. There are. So it's not like we can't do that. We can do that. So I still think, I hope that that's what we're going to do. At least the pandemic pushed us slightly in that direction.
Yeah. Have you got any hints and tips on how you can measure that? Because it's quite difficult, isn't it, to measure emotional intelligence and ability to connect socially with another employee, a colleague. Have you got any hints and tips on that at all?
Kate, you can actually measure it, but I think one of the issues is, and there's different ways of observing it as well. We don't take enough time when you're looking at managers. You're an HR person. I think the problem is we say, well, we got that post, let's advertise, let's shortlist, let's do that and do it quick. I remember once going to Barclays Bank and out in London, in Canary Wharf, and they had 4 HR directors and me, and we were talking about a whole load of issues to do with HR, and the HR. One of the HR directors of Barclays was there. But there was a bank. It's a Swedish bank. It was quite interesting. He said something like, we were talking about bonuses. You get lots of big bonuses in the banking industry, and all the HR directors said, we need bonuses because people expect them and everything else. The other bank said, we don't give bonuses. None at all. This Swedish guy. I said, well, what do you do? He says, here's what we do. What we do is we spend a lot of time recruiting all our managers to find out what they're like as people.
Okay.
Is he likable or she likable? We measure, we take psychometrics, we do all this sort of stuff, right? And we don't give them a yearly amount of money. So they get a good salary. We spend a lot of time up front recruiting them, making sure what they're like as people, do they fit our culture and everything else. However, the longer they stay with us, they get but when they leave after 10, 15 years, they get a big, huge bonus,
Okay.
particularly if they've delivered, right?
Yeah.
But we want to retain them. We want a culture. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be people coming in from time to time and refresh the organization. The point I think he was trying to make is up front, we don't spend enough time. And we'll spend, and if they're not happy, go elsewhere. We'll spend months recruiting a manager for that role. Does he or she fit the culture? Would I like working for them? Getting to know them about their personal life, their family, what they value. I love that, and I thought it was really good. It shocked everybody. So I think there are ways of getting this, but you have to spend the time. And it's an assessment center, Kate. You just spend longer time in the assessment center doing it, putting them into small groups, seeing, and just asking yourself the question as an HR person or as the manager of that particular group: would I want to work for this person? What do I see when I meet him on a number of occasions, and get the team to meet him, and just doing it that way. But I know it's we're too speedy, too fast, too trying to get the post appointed, frightened that we're going to lose the post if we don't get somebody in it, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And not, I think if we did more upfront things, you would get a person that would last longer, fit the culture, and deliver.
I think that's great advice, because the race for talent has been so full on, hasn't it? Trying to recruit when there was a select amount of candidates, that they've probably become more transactional in that activity. So I think that's really good advice for our clients.
Can I tell you one other thing, Kate, I would do, but HR doesn't do, but it should do. So HR does use psychometrics sometimes in recruiting managers. No question about it. But they use it the wrong way. So here's what they do. They'll say, well, I think we want somebody who is an extrovert or an introvert, because it could be an introvert if it's like auditing or some financial thing. Okay, this is the profile we think we need. Now, you don't know whether that profile is right or not. So if I was in HR, running an HR department, what I would do is I would look at all the people who are successful here. People like retention is high, productivity is good, morale is good with that leader. I would find out, then I would take psychometrics of all the successful ones, and then on the basis of that psychometric, because it could be really weird, some characteristics could come up which you wouldn't have expected if you're just saying, well, I think we want an extrovert. And then you find out that actually the people who've been most successful are more on the introvert range, because they listen to other people, they engage them, they're not putting their own views on them, they're not command and control. See what I mean? If HR collected those kind of analytics, I think they would do better. If you're going to use psychometric tools, make sure that for that group of people, the ones who have been successful, find out what their psychometrics are, and then use that in recruiting in the future.
Yeah, good advice. What good looks like. Yeah.
Yep.
In terms of strategy then, Cary, what kind of strategies are global leaders and organizations utilizing in this area?
Okay. I currently chair something called the National Forum for Health and Wellbeing at Work. It's made up of 50 global employers. 6 years ago, 6 chief medical officers and 3 chief medical officers and 3 HR directors came to see me at the business school, Manchester Business School, and said, Cary, we want a national forum and do something in this space, because we really think that the future of our company depends on the kind of culture we create, and we can change the culture. We believe we can, but we don't want to just sit around talking about it. We want to do things. That's gone up to now 52 companies. global, Shell, Microsoft, GSK, BP, it goes on and on, UK government, civil service, the BBC. Okay, all top and all senior people. And we meet. In fact, we're meeting next week in London at Clifford Chance,
Right.
the big lawyer. They're in it too. So we have all these organizations. And what they're interested in is making this a strategic issue. Okay, so what does it mean to make something a strategic issue? Okay, let's take a look at the gender pay gap. That's an issue. Was a big issue. Women getting paid on balance something like 18% less than men doing comparable job. So how did that start to narrow? It only narrowed when the board was mandated in the UK to have to publish the gender pay gap in their business, right? So then the chief exec, the chairman, the chief exec would say, come on, or the chairman of the board would say, look at, the gender pay gap's gone up to 20%. What the hell's going on here? CEO, get your act together, right? So what we feel at the National Forum is we need to put in place the following. Number one, we need on the board of all companies a non-executive director is responsible for employee health and well-being. If you truly say, as HR always does, the most valuable resource we have is our human resource, then action it by putting somebody on board who's responsible for it. It could be somebody who's doing something, but that's a part of their other responsibility. But in my view, the problem we've had, I think, in the UK is HR has not been a board appointment for a long time.
Yeah.
When I first came to the UK 50 years ago, actually, the HR directors were on it. We're on the board of they're not, and then they gradually just disappeared. Somebody have an HR role, but it's not somebody who's a professional, and that's bad.
Why do you think that is, Cary? Why do you think that HR directors aren't?
Because we went in, you know what we did? We started to think HR was all about employment law. Therefore, let's get on the board somebody who's a lawyer that protect us. Not let's do HR. Let's, in other words, what the tin says. Human resource management. It's not about that. It's let's make ourselves less vulnerable to litigation and follow employment law. So it's usually a lawyer took that role on boards or somebody like that. And that's not right. So number one, we think there has to be somebody who knows about HR. You know, I personally, it should be a professional, but a qualified CIPD or something kind of person. Doesn't have to be, but it has to be somebody who's had experience, in my view, doing HR. So we have one there. Now we got somebody on the board. What does that person need? That person needs the metrics to measure whether the organization is actually adhering, is developing a well-being culture. So what are the metrics? So my National Forum have created the metrics, right? And we're just refining it again now over the next 3 months. And that means there are subjective metrics like job satisfaction. That's subjective. But, it's job, if the board, so job satisfaction, how you perceive, how you're managed, a few metrics like that, perceptual ones, attitudinal ones. Then there's objective ones, labor turnover, very important because you want to retain people. Productivity, if you can measure it. Stress-related ill health.
Yeah.
And we have more of that. Presenteeism. Many companies now measure presenteeism, measure leaveism, which is a concept. Both those concepts I developed. Well, leaveism, by the way, is a concept I developed with Ian Heskett, who is a PhD student of mine working for Lancashire Police. He was an officer. He was an inspector responsible for well-being and things like that. And we were doing, for his PhD, he was doing a study of stress among police officers. And he found that a lot of police officers took their holiday time off to actually do the paperwork and didn't go with their families, but they pretended they were going with their families. So they said, I'm taking my 2 weeks now and we're going to Spain. And they would take all their work with them to Spain while the family had a good time and they did their work, or they didn't even go to Spain. So that's what we call leaveism. They were using their leave to do the work. And we all know what presenteeism is anyway, which is, coming to work when you're ill because you're worried about, getting a high sickness absence rate on your HR record, etc., and all that kind of stuff. So there should be objective measures and there should be subjective measures. And we are going to hone it down to about a dozen factors. Those factors should be looked at by the board on a regular basis, quarterly, not for long.
Okay.
There are companies that currently do this, by the way. Very few, but there's a particular organization, a big building company that does this on a regular basis, looks at it. I knew because when I had a University of Manchester spin-off company, that was one of our clients, and I used to go to the board and present the results quarterly. It was amazing. We showed them exactly what the labor turnover was. We showed them exactly when there was a problem when we did a well-being audit and then did an intervention, whether the intervention worked or not. We collected the data. That's the kind of thing you need. So we have a non-executive director at the board. We have metrics that person explores with the board on a regular basis, could be quarterly, 3 or 4 times a year to do that. Then we need somebody to operationalize if something's going wrong in the first place, and that we call the director of health and well-being. Now, most companies have that now. Almost all the companies in my national forum have a director of health and well-being. That person reports to the HR director or to the chief medical officer, or in some cases directly to the CEO. All right? And that means you got the structure. You got the structure. So you report to the board and you say, look what's happened here. Labor turnover is very high in this part of Peninsula Group. Right? So what the hell is going on? It goes down to the director of health and well-being, find out what the hell is going on. Do an audit, do whatever you have to do it, find out what it is and fix it. That's how things get done. They get done because boards demand it. Now, the NHS already have that, incidentally. They already have a non-executive director already in every hospital in the country. Forgot what they call it, Kate. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if you guys work with the hospitals, but every hospital now
I couldn't tell you
unless
you know, Jonathan. I wouldn't know the name.
It's employee health and well-being. I forgot the name they call it. They don't call it anyway. They don't.
Yeah.
It's not called a non-executive director, but it's on that person's on the board. That's the first organization to do it. We need more to do that now in the private sector. So we have to, and then things will change because it will be a quote bottom line issue, just like gender pay gap became a bottom line issue for the company. You're damaging our brand by the gender pay gap going up. We have to do something about it.
Yeah, gets attention. I mean, we've got manifestos coming out of our ears right now, haven't we? It's hard to keep up with what's going on, but certainly one thing that Labour have pledged is to introduce a right to disconnect. Similar to that in Ireland.
Wow, that's a good one. Yeah, that's a really good one. Okay, so at the moment, it started with France 5 years ago, roughly. So France, the right to disconnect law, which in effect says the following. It says that no manager can send an email out of office hours to their subordinates. That means at night, at the weekend, and when they're on holiday. Okay? Okay. Many companies before that, even before they did that, like Volkswagen, actually closed servers down at their headquarters at 5:30 and then turned them on in the morning. All right. So that was going on already. Now, here's the problem I have with the right to disconnect law. I like it in principle. France did it. Spain, Portugal, Germany, they all now have it. I don't know if Germany has it yet, but I think it's getting it. Spain and Portugal have it. New Zealand has it. Many EU countries are starting to move in that direction. The problem I have with it is this. People want to work flexibly. Even before the pandemic, they've wanted to work flexibly. How can you work flexibly if you can't send an email to somebody at night or do your work at night because the law says you can't? So you're a manager, you need to know something. What I would rather do, so I think there's a a fine dividing line here. I think what should happen is organizations should say to all their managers, all their line managers from shop floor to top floor, you do not send emails unless absolutely necessary to your subordinates, and you don't send it saying you don't have to do this till Monday. You don't send it at all. But if something really significant has happened and it affects your performance and the company's image or whatever, then you deal with it. You deal with it and you use that thing. But I like the principle that underlies it.
Yeah.
However, I'm just worried what will happen if people feel I need to get in touch with Fred because this huge client of ours is bailing out and going elsewhere. I need Fred to deal with this now. I mean, it really is. And Fred will understand when I call him or get in touch with him, email him. It's important. So that's the downside of it. There was a British company, incidentally, because I never thought it would be actioned. You know, you have this law, but who's going to complain? And a British company in operating in France broke the law. A number of employees complained, and they were fined 60,000 euros. But it was all over the paper, so it wasn't the 60,000 euros. It was the damage. It was Rent-to-Kill Initial, the merged company of Rent-to-Kill Initial, was the one who broke the French law, and was fine. So, but I don't think it's about that. I think I like it in the sense of message, but I would rather senior management introduce their own right to disconnect policy, which is don't, as a manager, send it unless it's really important. And if it's not important and you do it, then we might take action. Something like that.
I think I'm with you on that. The message is great. You know, there's so many emails flying around organisations that are just unnecessary. So the message is great, and the feeling that can create when it lands with you on a Saturday night at 8 o'clock when you're trying to relax, you know, it can be really detrimental. So I'm with you. I think it's business dependent and something that embraces that message, but is fitting to the operational requirements of that business. A nice balance to it.
And you have to make it clear, don't you? You're HR, you're director of HR. You have to make it bloody clear. Here is, you know, it has to be really quite important, because the research shows. I had one of my PhD students who just finished a year ago. And then I had one at Lancaster when I was at Lancaster, a French student of mine. We were looking at the stress of emails, and it's really causing trouble. And it's mainly causing trouble because of this.
Tell me about it.
It's not. It didn't cause trouble before. We just had a mobile phone without it being a smartphone. The minute it became a smartphone, that became a problem, because everybody starts emailing people, and you go out. You see, on a Friday night, I'll go into Poynton where I live, and I can see on a Friday night the mom and the dad on their bloody phones doing their emails while the kids are on their phones playing games. But if their parents weren't doing it, maybe they talk to their parents. Do you know what I mean? And it's not healthy. Just not healthy for us as a society, really.
I think it's just too much, too overwhelming. A lot of people I know now are having online detoxes, you know, just having, and I think there's merit in that. Just that immediacy and constant information is just too much. So
we need to deal with it.
It isn't just emails though, is it? It's Teams, it's other ways of communicating as well. And I agree. The laws in France are great because it does kind of deal with that old way of working where the manager would insist you would do something whenever they want you to do something. But I think technology now, because you can access it and be targeted, if you like, whenever, 24 hours, 7 days a week, it's the communication strategy I think needs to be the one that needs to be targeted more, whereby it's the strategy dependent upon the team or the actual division is salient to that team or division, and you have to tailor it to how they work as well, because it's a global world we work in as well. And if you're communicating with companies in different countries, like the company you mentioned, Cary, you're going to get people who send emails or Teams messages at different times. So it's coming up with a strategy to deal with communication in general, because people are switched on all the time, and I think academia is very similar to that, where you do take leave to either do research or to catch up with the bureaucracy, if you like. That's definitely prevalent in this sector, but it's down to the manager. It comes back to that line manager to create a really good culture and to say, well, actually, if you're on leave, you're on leave, and shout at them if you like, to say what you're doing, communicating. You don't need to communicate. But also the final thing I found is that you need support mechanisms around people. It's all very well say don't touch your emails for 2 weeks, but everyone panics about what's going to hit me in 2 weeks. What am I going to face in 2 weeks? So having deputies and having support around those people to say, well, if I'm on leave, I'm on leave. And I know and trust people are going to deal with any issues that are going to crop up as well.
Yeah, I think you're right about the comm strategy. We just have to have a better one. The one thing we don't do, what takes most of our time up?
Yeah.
Meetings, number one. Emails, number two. Right? And all of that stuff. First of all, do we ever train anybody as a manager to run a meeting? Do you know the best way to run a meeting? What kind of a moron starts a meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning? Because you start at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're going to go to 12. You start the meeting at 11 o'clock or 11:30. It'll get done by 12:30 because people want to go for lunch. In other words, you have to think through, and do I need this meeting? First question, why am I calling this meeting? Am I faking it as a manager? I really want to make this decision, but I'll act like people are engaged in the decision-making process. Therefore, I'll call a meeting. Even though no matter what they say to you, you're still going to do what you originally did in the first place. And I don't mind, by the way, a manager making a decision, because the managers, and usually a good manager is the one who would go around informally anyway and find out, I'm thinking of doing that. What do you think, Fred? Janet, what do you think, Janet? Right? And then they do. Why then call a meeting to play a game? And the game is I'm engaging you. I'm going to get a big engagement score as a consequence of the way I do this. I really think we just don't look at those aspects. And I think we take a lot of people's times up with unnecessary meetings, really do. And most of them are too long, not well managed.
Do you remember the management consultant, Sir John Harvey Jones? He's called Troubleshooter, yeah. I expect you do know him. And one of his tactics was, I think it was in maybe MG, the big car production company. I can't quite remember the company, but they had board meetings. They went on for hours, literally hours and hours and hours. And people would just talk in the meetings for the sake of it, or they felt they had to talk. So he gave them all water pistols. And if anybody talked too long or wasn't relevant to the meeting, you could shoot them with water. And it was his idea to say, look, this meeting needs to be efficient, effective, and running in the right way, but only be useful for whatever the meeting is for.
One of my team will say, I'm just so busy. I'll say, right, let's just sit down. We'll go through your diary, and I'll go, cancel that, cancel. And there's just so much noise that just doesn't need to be happening. So I think really practical things like that, regular interventions where you just make sure everyone's focused on the task in hand and the time is being used to the best benefit of the individual and the business is really key. Because your 7.5 hour day can just be consumed with noise.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think we don't train managers enough on these kind of issues. When you're managing people, if you're doing a meeting, call a meeting only when you really need to. The meeting should really be about either communicating something, or actually truly getting their input, and it'll make a difference because you'll listen to them. Otherwise, if you're not going to listen to them and you think something should be done, then just bloody do it. And little things, all these little things build up, make your day. Don't send emails out of office hours to people. Make sure you don't copy everybody in the whole world, CC in the whole world. A lot of companies don't send an email to somebody in your same office. Go walk over and talk to the human being, see him eyeball to eyeball. They're just easy steps which organizations don't do.
But why don't companies do it, Cary? Based on your research and your consultancy, why? Because I think it's well known within certain industries and sectors. But why don't companies do that? Train line managers up in things like that.
I don't know why they don't. I think HR thinks I think maybe it started a long time ago. HR thought that's just a kind of trivial thing. You don't do that with adult workers who are called managers. You don't tell them little things like that, but you should do. What is good practice on this? But unless you do, I remember when the National Forum first started 7 years ago, we were looking at the topics that they thought were really critical for the well-being of their employees. So number one topic was the line manager. Number one, overwhelmingly, everybody said, if we had one magic bullet, give me an EQ line manager anytime. I won't have any major problems. Number two was emails and communication things. We then set up a subgroup. And at that time, we had the MD of Twitter on, Bruce Daisley. He was lovely, great guy. Twitter, the whole of Europe and the Far East, and he was great. He said, I'm going to set up a group in the National Forum, and we're going to come up with what is good practice when it comes to emails, right? And we did it. But when I asked everybody, at that time, we didn't have as many as 52 members. We had maybe 20 some odd. I said, how many of you have guidance on emails? One. Only one. Like, I was stunned. You have no guidance at all. No, we don't, we don't do that. So don't CC in everybody, go to see people face to face, etc. It's all that. And we had just a simple 2-pager, which then went out to the 25 companies or something organizations we had at the time. So I think those aren't trivial issues because they take your time up.
I just remember something that really resonated with me that you said at one of our training events, and you were talking about how when people now look back to how their parents worked, and like my dad worked 3 jobs, riding a bike to work, did that job, went to his other, worked every hour God sent, really did what he had to do, work was work. You came home from work and there was no real emotional connection with work. And you were talking about how that has absolutely and dramatically changed, and how the younger generations of today have a completely different expectation of the workplace, and they look at the parents and they literally think, my life's not going to be like that. Yeah. It really resonated with me. Would you just go into that a little bit for the audience? Would that be
okay? Now, the Z generation and the young millennials, okay, let's call that, those are generations I'm talking about. And I think they're called snowflakes, right? So the older generation think, what are these people? I mean, they only stay in a job a year and they bugger off, right? And, they're not committed. They want smoothies at their desk and sushi and the rest of it, and no, they don't. But think about that generation, particularly the Z generation. Their parents went through the financial crisis of 2008. That a lot of people lost their job. That was a profound. That wasn't a recession. That was a depression. That was the second depression of that century, of this. We've had over 100 years. So my own view is they're saying, I want good quality of working life. I'm going to work hard, but I'm not going to kill myself. I'm not going to do the 60, 70-hour weeks you buggers have done. I am going to work hard, and then I want to have an outside life. I want to have relationships. If I have kids, I want to spend time with them. I want to do that. But I will work hard. I'll go the extra mile. But if it's not a good place to work, given that, number one, I can't afford to buy a house anyway, that generation, who can afford, they can't buy a house now, right? They're renting. So I don't have the insecurity around my neck that my parents had, who had giant mortgages, right? I am going to, if I don't like it here, I'm gone. What do I care? Number one, I have degrees more than they have. I know IT better than they did. Guess what? I'll get a job. I don't have a mortgage. I don't care. So I can do that. So they're perceived by the older generation. You can see this politically. We're hearing them talk, the young generation, they don't want to work hard and everything else. No, they want to work. They want to have good quality of working life. right? Um, and Andy Burnham has said that he has in the Greater Manchester, he has the Good Employment Charter, which I was involved in at the beginning, and that's a good
Yeah.
idea. Let's get good work here. Let's get the right people managing people. Let's do all this, and so the region can shine. And it is
Yeah.
shining. It is very, very buoyant as a consequence of that. So that generation, okay, they want something that they weren't prepared to tolerate crap work that the parents, because they
Yeah.
had mortgages basically, and I have to look after, I have to work on 3 jobs and like your dad. So I think if you want to retain them, you want to attract them, you'll get a lot out of them if you treat them properly. You let them work flexible if they
Yeah.
want to, you will. And yet they won't stay with you if they think it's a lousy place and you're not using their talents, you're not training them, you're not upskilling them, you're not
Yeah.
doing any of that. They will go.
Mm.
Right. Their parents should have done that.
Yeah.
We had Ian MacArthur on, from the director of the Greater Manchester.
Yeah, I know Ian
Employment
well.
Charter.
Great guy.
He's one of our guests earlier on in the series, and he laid out the
He
principles of the charter, which you can sign up to and work towards, and it was a good template for organisations who don't necessarily have the resources of HR to work towards. So that was good. The question I've got for you, Cary, is looking at it from a different angle, the kind of skepticism angle of health and well-being, because I think that's a barrier sometimes for organisations to implement things properly. When I worked in HR, it was, I've got a back problem. So I used to work in the rail industry in HR. I've got a back problem, and it was hard to diagnose specifically whether they did have a back problem or not. And there's that skepticism about, yeah, they've got a back problem and they're off. And the skepticism now, and Kate will have a better angle on this, I think, with the companies you work with, there is skepticism about health and well-being and anxiety. So how do you get over that in terms of how can organisations say, well, there might be some people who do try it on a little bit, but in the main it is an issue and people are suffering. How do you get around that issue?
Okay. First of all, here's how you get around that issue. We're not exactly the most buoyant economy at the moment, are we? Where are we? We're bouncing along the bottom, right? We're in effect, we're in recession. We're not legally in recession. We haven't had 2 quarters of it. We're at 0.1%, 0.2%, right? That's not exactly what I would call growth. The Conservative Party call it growth. I wouldn't call that growth. All right. So we're bouncing along the bottom. Jobs are insecure. People are worried about their security, right? Because that's what organizations do in times like this. They shed labor as much as they can, right? And they dump the load on everybody else. What person would want to claim that they have a mental health problem in a job insecure market like we're in? If they're admitting that they're having anxiety or depression or whatever, it's real. It's against their best self-interest to own up to their employer in this market when employers are looking to shed labor. There's no way. So the point is, they're not faking it because they don't want to work, which is what I'm afraid I think the DWP or Mel Stride has been saying. They're trying to leave. They want to. They're not working hard. They're just faking it. They're faking their anxiety or depression. He doesn't say it quite like that, but he implies it in the way he says it. And he's totally wrong, because the last thing in the world you want to admit to your employers you're not coping, right? And admitting that you have, there's still a stigma associated with mental health. And so it's not accurate. It's not accurate. In fact, that's the whole purpose of presenteeism. Presenteeism is where you're not going to talk to your employer and tell them, and you are actually off with mental health as a big leading cause of presenteeism is still mental health issues. And so that's the majority of people. And you take a look at the CIPD figures and all the other figures, presenteeism is double the cost of absenteeism and double the number of people taking it, because they're frightened to death of losing their jobs. So they feel low, very anxious, very depressed, still going to work. What added value are they contributing? Very little.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Unless, by the way, they've been treated and are getting treatment, and the treatment says, I think you should still go to work, but just don't work in the same way and don't push yourself, right? So my own view is they're not avoiding, they're not saying they've got this problem just to avoid work. They're saying it because if they're saying it, and it's not presenteeism, they're not going to work, but they're saying they need help, like going to an EAP or whatever for this kind of thing, or going for counseling, then it's real in the vast majority of cases. I'm not saying there aren't one or two people who, you know, don't, who exploit it. There always is, but that's not the majority of people.
So
I suppose, conscious of time, etc., to kind of wrap us up, we will have thousands of SMEs listening to this who don't have a wellbeing budget. They just don't have the funds to spend on it. They're keeping their head above water and growing. What are the key top three, top two, top three things they can focus on to really get under the skin of this area and ensure for a really good culture and good well-being for their staff that isn't going to cost the world and they can practically apply in there every day? Have you got any hints and tips around that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the top would be anybody in a managerial role in your organization, make sure that they have good people skills. You really spend time, particularly in an SME, in small and medium-sized enterprises. Make sure you get that. That's number one. That's number one. Number two, always ask them what they would like to do. I remember I was once a non-executive director of a small little company, and they said to me, we're going to give shares to our employees. There were 3 Cambridge graduates who set up a technology type based company, and they wanted to give their shares to employees because they said that they thought that was a great idea. And I said to them, have you asked them if that's what they want? No, but I mean, I'm sure they want to have shares in the business. I said, that's fine. Yeah, that's great, but ask them. So I said, okay, you go ask them. Your job, you're on the board. You go ask them. So I went to ask them, and none of them wanted it. So I said, what do you want? And they said, you know what we want? For us and our families, we would like medical insurance, private medical insurance. I went back and I said, that's what they said. And they said, you're kidding. I said, no, I'm not kidding. And that's what they want. Now, give them what they want. So listen to them. That's the second one. Listen to your employees. What are the things that will make your job better? Improve the job, make you feel happier, and so on. So listen to the employees. And the good thing about SMEs and those kind of companies is they tend, I know the people who are owner managers tend not necessarily, they're more entrepreneurial, but there'll be somebody up there who will have that facility to listen to them and take it on board to the senior leadership team. That's another one. And I think the other thing is get to know them as people, get to know their families, make it a family, particularly small businesses, because people like that. My students say to me when they get back, I said, Cary, I went to work for this big corporate. It was dreadful. Now I work for a medium-sized company, small, medium, just 100 employees. It's wonderful. I feel I'm doing something. I have a sense of purpose. Create that kind of culture. Yeah, be kind to people. God, that's not really complicated science.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Really, really practical tip. And that sense of belonging is just so valuable, isn't it, to your everyday employment. So thanks for that.
Okay, well, thanks, Cary. You've been fantastic, as we knew you would be. You're I know as an academic, you're a titan in our field. So I think we're both privileged to have you on our podcast.
Not what my kids would say about me, Jonathan, but it's okay. I'm not a titan in their world. That's for sure.
Kids always bring you down to reality, Cary. But
I know they do. Thank God they do. It's good. It's healthy for all of us.
Okay, thank you very much, Cary.
Thank you, guys.
You can watch HR Unpacked on YouTube or listen to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other platforms. Just search for HR Unpacked.